of the Midlands, but the large majority are in the south. So we initially began working with a company called Elements in Pinner, and it basically started out by we used their premises to basically establish ourselves in the south. But within 3 to 6 months we'd completely outgrown being able to use their premises as like an addition to their existing work. So we eventually secured premises in Hounslow, which is where Heathrow Airport is. So that's where our head office and main facilities are based. Now, at our premises, we have on-site mortuary facilities and refrigeration for up to 40 deceased people. And those facilities are designed to also cater for, as you're probably aware, a lot of repatriations opt for American-style caskets. So obviously the racking we have and the cold storage facilities have to accommodate that kind of size of casket. We also have a chapel of rest there if any of our clients wish to visit their loved one before the repatriation. And obviously we have our offices there as well, where we do all our admin. So we're slightly different to other repatriation companies that you may have heard of, companies such as Key Air, for example, who are quite a well-known repatriation company. They are, in theory, a freight forwarder. So with Key Air, they will book the flight for you, and then they will also collect the coffin from you if you wish, and take the coffin to Heathrow Airport or whichever airport of departure. And then you pay them for the air freight for the deceased, and you'll also pay them for the transportation. With us, we're actually a combination of that and being a funeral director. So our job, we're employed by families to do the repatriation service, as well as we book the flight and everything. So we're a one-stop shop, really. We do the whole process. We do offer services to other funeral directors, whether it's just booking flights or taking care of the whole process. Now, the benefits that I've noticed that funeral directors using our services are that obviously they have our expertise throughout the whole process. So even if they're just booking the flight through us, if they want advice on embassy paperwork or any requirements for what happens when the deceased gets to the final destination, in most circumstances we've got experience from dealing with it quite recently. But also we can take care of as much or as little of the process as you would like. For example, if you wanted to carry out the removal, the embalming and providing the coffin, and then hand over to us to do the embassy paperwork and obviously booking the flight and transferring the deceased to the airport, we can work with you to get to a point that suits you as a company. Some companies hand the whole process over to us and basically are like a middleman to liaise with their client, which again works perfectly fine. But that's really our business in essence. And we're probably averaging around 300 of our own cases a year, and probably another 200 cases with through other companies. So that's where we're at this stage. And obviously we've been in our premises now for nearly 3 years in London. So back in 2019, which was quite early on in our company's history, we were approached by the Vietnamese embassy following the tragedy that took place in Essex. Now, the reason we were approached by the embassy was that they were looking for a company to work with to facilitate the repatriation of the remains back to Vietnam. But as you can imagine, there was a lot of press coverage about the situation because it was obviously people trying to come into the UK to work illegally. So there was high press coverage. There was obviously issues with the border force, etc., where how these people hadn't been found en route, and then obviously how these people had actually died. So obviously Essex coroners were appointed, obviously, to take care of the investigation, which was quite an in-depth, as you can imagine, an in-depth and thorough process. And obviously Essex police as well were highly involved in that process. The embassy wanted to find a company that was big enough to cope with the process, but small enough where information wouldn't get leaked. There was a small enough team to be able to deal with it efficiently, but obviously in complete privacy. So we had actually carried out a repatriation for a Vietnamese family the year prior. A young 11-year-old lad who passed away sadly with a brain tumour. His mother approached us, and we took care of him and got him back to Vietnam. And this lady was actually a translator for the Vietnamese embassy. So obviously they were recommended to us via that repatriation we carried out. So when we were approached, it was initially to discuss how we could actually help as a company. So we set up a number of face-to-face meetings at the embassy to try and really plan how we could take care of such a large process in a very short space of time. Now, culturally, in Vietnam, people are buried very quickly. So you can imagine the families in Vietnam were, obviously distraught. They'd lost their loved ones, but with how long things take to investigate here in the UK, they were desperate to get their loved ones home. So when we met with the embassy, they initially wanted to get all of the deceased back to Vietnam on one flight. So we initially planned to do that, but as you can imagine, with this kind of thing, it was there was moving targets the whole way through, which added another layer of complexity to the process, because we would plan, for example, to have all the coffins ready for a certain date, and then at the last minute the dates changed, or the goalpost changed, where initially we were going to repatriate all 39 victims, but actually 7 of them were initially cremated, and the rest were repatriated. So the planning stage was really crucial in the whole process. Bearing in mind as well, we had our own cases at the time to deal with, and we're only a small company. There's only four full-time staff. So eventually, when it got to the stage where Essex Police and the coroner had completed their investigation, and in theory the deceased were ready to be repatriated, we then obviously were at the stage where the embassy wanted to get some dates sorted and try and get this thing moving, so we could let the families know in Vietnam when their loved ones would be returning. So how it actually worked in the end was, on the Wednesday, which I can't remember the exact day, but on the Wednesday we were told by the embassy that we got the thumbs up to move forward and begin the process. The following Monday, we actually collected 16 of the deceased from the mortuary in Essex who were going to be repatriated. And we also collected 7 of the deceased who were going to be cremated. So that process involved the deceased being placed into hermetically sealed coffins, coffins wrapped to be shipped. And it also included the conveyance of those coffins from the mortuary over to Heathrow. The 7 deceased who were going to be cremated were then taken to our facilities in Hounslow, and the cremations took place the following day. We were then returned back to the mortuary on the Thursday of that week to collect the other 16 deceased and obviously carry out again the coffining and wrapping of the coffins and delivery of the coffins to the airport. So there was, in the end, 2 flights. The first flight took 16 remains in full coffins, and the second flight, which was on the Friday, that took 16 remains in coffins, plus the 7 sets of cremated remains. And also, on both flights, there were personal effects that we had to deal with and ship as well. Now, as you can imagine, dealing with that number, 39 cases at once, and the majority had the same surname, because in Vietnam they have a number of surnames that they all share, so the majority had the same surname. So we had to take obviously great care in, 1, identification of the deceased, but 2, making sure that all of the paperwork for each deceased matched up correctly. So I've actually got some of the documentation that we used to show you how we actually kept track of everything. One of the things we did, we introduced, we don't usually use this in our company, but we introduced a colour code system. So as well as having the name of the deceased, their home address, their date of birth, we also had a colour for that person as well. So that gave us an extra check. So if we were going through the paperwork and everything seemed okay, but then the colour didn't match, we knew there was an issue. So to start with, we were given by the embassy a list. I don't know whether you can see that. That was an example of a list we were given by the embassy of the deceased, and they were issued a number 1 to 39, which was the embassy's reference. We then had the post-mortem reference number from the coroner. We had the full name, date of birth, address, the province they were from in Vietnam. So this list is what we had to work from to process all of the paperwork. So I don't know whether anyone's arranged a repatriation here before, but one of the key documents that are required are an out of England certificate and a free from infection certificate. So we had to individually request from the coroner an out of England certificate for each of the 39 victims, excluding the cremations, obviously. And also we had to request free from infection certificates from the pathologists. So obviously we had to do this within 2 working days prior to us beginning the process on the Monday. So the way we kept track of everything was, I'm just going to show you now one of our funeral director's declarations, which is one of the documents we have to issue when we're repatriating a body. This is the document which basically has the information about the deceased here in a bit of a statement by us here. Now that's how our document usually looks, but we also added this bit here, which was the case reference number, which was the post-mortem number by the coroner, and also see this yellow square here. As you'll see on another example, this is another example of the same document, but this had a green square. Now, that was a way of us tracking the deceased name, against the reference number and also a colour, and we had matching colour toe tags. So when each deceased, when they were brought out of the refrigeration at the mortuary, we had to check their full name, which was obviously on the ID tag that the mortuary had put onto the deceased, the date of birth, and the post-mortem reference number. But what we then had to do was, at request of the embassy, is we had a document called a deceased identity sheet, which acted as a way of us checking the identity of the deceased, but also it acted as the label for the coffin as well, for when the deceased got to Vietnam. So I'll just show you an example. Now, we laminated these sheets. So this was the photo given by the embassy for that particular person. That was the name, the date of birth, the address, and then the colour and the case reference number. So at each stage of the process, from when they were taken out of the mortuary fridge, when we checked their ID, when the coffin was sealed, and when this was placed on top, this was a way of keeping check an identity of each person, because as you can imagine, when the initial 16 coffins landed in Vietnam, those 16 coffins were actually being transported across country. They weren't all going to the same place, so it was extremely important that there was no mistakes made on the other end. They had ambulances lined up at the airport ready to receive the deceased. So from a point of view of the documentation, if you looked at each individual case, they were very similar to what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. But dealing with it at that volume, it was almost a completely different process, because obviously it would be unlikely for you to have 16 people in your care with exactly the same surname, and obviously the names aren't, they're not British names, so the pronunciation and things is very different, and very difficult to keep on top of. So from our point of view, that was the key element, really, to making sure everything ran smoothly, and it did. Luckily, everything was. Initially, things were very slow whilst we got into the rhythm of dealing with each individual, but we had help from the morticians at the coroner's mortuary, which was good. And it was a difficult process and long hours. Each day we were doing, I think it was 16 hours each day we worked to actually carry out the process. But obviously, from a point of view of experience for our company, it was good for our whole team to deal with, because it was something that we'll probably never deal with anything like that ever again in our careers.
Hopefully not. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think from a point of view of the process, to where it differed to a normal repatriation was, obviously we didn't have contact with the families at that stage. So we were fully instructed by the embassy, who were funding the whole process. But we were also surveillanced by the embassy, to a point where at the mortuary where we dealt with the process, the embassy had 2 representatives with cameras, and the whole process from start to finish was recorded by photograph by the embassy. And we were also required to make exactly the same records as the embassy did. So we had a member of staff with us that took photographs and video of the whole process throughout the 2 days, and then all of that data had to be handed over to the embassy on a secure memory stick. Now, the reason for that, I was explained, is that obviously with the embassy funding the process and the chance of being any issues with identity, etc., the embassy wanted to have a record so that they could refer back to if there was any problems. But as you can imagine, trying to do what we were doing with cameras in your face was quite intrusive, and it was not very easy to deal with. The other thing we had to deal with, which was quite different to our normal way of repatriation, is all the personal effects of the deceased. Now, when they opened the lorry, when the deceased were initially found, most of them had taken their clothing off because of the heat. But as you can imagine, once they'd all passed away, their personal effects were strewn throughout the lorry, which included clothing, mobile phones, just small trinkets, things like that. So there was a huge effort by the police to try and identify whose clothing was whose, etc. And eventually there were 2 suitcases full of personal effects that we had to repatriate along with the deceased. That actually took to deal with that longer than dealing with 5 or 6 of the deceased. And the reason for that was there was a hell of a lot of paperwork to go through and make sure that each item had been labelled correctly for that correct person. Because obviously the phones are like the last memories the families are going to have of their loved ones, photos taken up to the day of what happened, etc. It's all on there, and that they were absolutely precious to the family. So again, that was something that we don't often deal with, but was really key to this whole process. And also the clothing, some of it was kept for the families if it was clothing they'd been carrying with them. Some of it obviously was disposed of during the post-mortem examinations. But yeah, the families were able to receive their loved ones back however they'd chosen. So 7 families chose to receive their loved ones' ashes, and the rest were repatriated in full coffin form. So our involvement really paused when the deceased actually got to Vietnam. The next thing I saw of it was on the news. You saw the planes landing and the coffins being unloaded, etc. And one thing we were really good at doing as a company was keeping it all under wraps, because until after the process had all taken place, apart from our four in our team, nobody knew about the process that we were dealing with it. So we had no press intervention, no press were at the airport trying to take photos of us taking the coffins there, etc. So we were really pleased at how that went, because I was worried throughout the whole process that if the press got wind of what was happening, it could have really caused problems with everything. We could have had press at the mortuary, we could have had press at the airport waiting for us to arrive, trying to get a glimpse of the coffins, etc. But we were really lucky that didn't happen. Now, I was actually invited by the Vietnamese embassy to actually visit Vietnam in December of 2019 to actually meet all of the families of the deceased. So eventually, how it worked is I flew out there with my colleague Alan and my colleague Matthew as well. And when we got to Vietnam, we met up with this lady called Van, who was the mother of the 11-year-old lad I repatriated back to Vietnam. And her being a translator, she basically travelled around Vietnam with us and was our middle person between us and the families. So we got to meet all of the families face to face. go into their homes, and obviously just offer our condolences following what had happened, and answer any questions they had, because as you can imagine, they didn't understand the British process of the coroner, how the deceased were cared for up until they were repatriated, etc. So it really helped put their mind at ease as to what had happened throughout the process. Obviously, nothing's going to really help losing a loved one the way they did. There was children as part of the 39 victims. There was a 15-year-old lad, I remember specifically meeting his mother, but they got great comfort in a visit from us, which for us as well really helped us to realise what we'd actually done, what we'd actually been involved in, because we spent 4 days visiting all the families. So you can imagine it was nearly 10 families a day we visited, because obviously some of them were in the same districts, and we had a minibus to take us around, it was, I think it was good closure for everybody really, that visit. And then once that had completed, we then returned back to the UK, and we had to do a complete handover to the embassy. Just finalising all of the documentation, ensuring that they had all of the records they required regarding the photos and the video, etc. And that was it really. That was the end of the process. And since obviously we've worked with a lot of Vietnamese families who are relatives of those who we repatriated. We've got a really good connection with the community now, which is good for us as a company. But also we've had a number of other funeral directors contact us regarding they may be looking after a Vietnamese family for repatriation or for cremation and then shipping of the ashes, and they've contacted us regarding how things are done over in Vietnam, etc. And us having the contacts over there and contacts with the embassy, it seems to make the whole process a lot smoother. So it's been it was definitely an experience that's helped us grow as a company, and I hope that what I've explained to you today has been a bit of an insight into that kind of thing. It was my first time dealing with a multiple disaster like it was, and obviously it's not something that happens all the time. So if there's ever a time where there is anything with multiple victims, you have to step back and really look at what you're dealing with and treat it as almost something that you've never done before. Because from my experience, we'd repatriated thousands of deceased prior to this, but this was just a different ball game. So I mean, I don't know whether anyone has any questions at all about the process.
Well, if I could just say before I hand over to everybody else, I think we can all agree, just a massive well done to you. It's quite moved actually about it. I think it's massive what you've done. I think, like you said, doing firstly that volume, that amount of people that you've looked after under the circumstances, you can't really train for that really. You've got to just, and like you say with the surnames. The colour coding is, I think it's fantastic what you did there. But yeah, just a massive well done. I think, fantastic. But yeah, any questions for Ed at all? Anyone wants to ask? Any virtual guys want to ask any questions? No, I think it's been, you've explained, I was writing down questions throughout, and then you answered them throughout. So you've really, really clear. The one question I do have is you mentioned the 7 people that were cremated in the UK prior to going back to Vietnam. Not just preference, was it, by the family, just to get it done before they come back?
It was a bit of a strange situation. The embassy originally wanted all of the deceased to be cremated because of the cost. Because the air freight, even though the air freight was actually provided by Vietnam Airlines, which is the government-owned airline, they still charged full IATA rate for the air freight. So for each deceased person, the air freight alone was £2,000. So the embassy tried to reduce costs by trying to force all the families to have a cremation here and then have the ashes repatriated, because it would have saved probably £1,500 per case.
Yeah.
And when you times that by 39, that's huge. But actually what happened was the first 7 cases agreed to cremation, and that was actually under pressure from the government in Vietnam, because they had to go and see each family and get them to sign documentation to agree to either cremation or repatriation. And from what I gather, those families were pressured into choosing cremation. But then there was some intervention over in Vietnam, and that's why there was only 7 that chose that. Otherwise, I think they probably would have had them repatriated fully back. It was just the pressure they were getting the other side. Because I don't know whether anyone's read about this, but what actually happened was the Vietnamese government stepped forward to say they would fund it, but they actually converted the funding to loans. So the families in Vietnam actually have to pay the government back for the repatriation. And there hasn't been much coverage of this. And I think they did that when they realised that they were all going to be repatriated, well, the majority, rather than cremation, because of the expense. So these families now have, number one, remortgaged their homes to pay for their loved one to get to the UK. Because the traffickers charged £35,000 to do that. So these families had remortgaged their land and their homes to get their loved ones to the UK to work. They then have to pay the government back to get their loved ones' bodies back to Vietnam to be buried. So you can imagine how many lives have been destroyed because of this.
Yeah.
What happened?
I know the UK government get a slamming, but I can't imagine that happening here. Taking out loans, it's pretty severe, isn't it? Really.
It was the whole process. I mean, I've got a good working relationship with the Vietnam embassy and the team there, but they were trying to do their best for the families, because they were the ones having to deal with the families by phone, etc., and actually deal with the rawness of the process. But their management in Vietnam, from the government in Vietnam, were putting them under extreme pressure to try and reduce costs, try and get the families to have cremation, etc. So there's a lot of corruption, unfortunately.
That again, I'm not going too far here, but because it was illegal, do you think that might have anything to do with that as well? The fact that it was a legal activity, why they did that?
I think from the Vietnam side of things, they were. What the embassy told me is that the Vietnamese government were embarrassed that their people had tried to leave the country and get into the UK illegally, which is why they wanted to keep it all hush hush.
Yeah.
So it was quite a strange process. The other issue we actually had was with Essex Police. Now, I've never had dealings in that sense with the police until this case. And after we got back from Vietnam, from our trip, I had the chief constable contact me, asking what we were doing in Vietnam, and that we were potentially disturbing evidence and all sorts of stuff with the investigation.
It's like raising the profile of what's happened almost.
Yeah. Well, the on the basis, we'd been invited by the Vietnamese government to do it. I think we eventually found out that basically the Essex police would like to have gone themselves, but the police wouldn't fund their trip. So the job we did of visiting all these families, and obviously we're not in any way trained to do social work or anything like that. Obviously the police wanted to do it, but they couldn't get the funding, so it was a bit of a sore subject with them.
I think you did that, like going over there. So you just not say the word you use for not just for your guys, but obviously more importantly for them. But the fact it helps you with closure, that's the key thing, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. It just helped you realise what you'd actually, the severity of what you dealt with and the sheer volume.
Yeah. Selena, your hands up.
Sorry, it's probably a really stupid question, but when you're repatriating ashes, obviously we've had people take ashes abroad or bring ashes from abroad. Do you have to change how you send them? Because obviously you send a body differently, don't you, in a different coffin? Do you have to send ashes in a different way than you'd send them normally?
Well, the reason for hermetically sealing a coffin is actually down to airline regulations and IATA, who manage the freight. And the reason for it is to try and stop leakage and infection.
Yeah.
The stipulation for cremated remains is it's got to be a sealed container. So you can
seal.
No, sealed.
Or sealed.
Yes.
Sealed. Oh, okay.
You can get zinc lined ashes caskets.
I suppose there's no point though, is there? Because it's weight and there's nothing, nothing. Okay. But you just wrap them like you'd wrap the coffin and then obviously label it as the same and you'd hope it would stay together, would you?
Well, for this case with Vietnam, we bought ashes urns, like steel urns, and then we glued the lids on, and then they were packaged in the cardboard boxes that they came in and shipped in that way. So it was extremely unlikely to be any issues with that. I mean, you can take cremated remains as hand luggage on most airlines,
Yeah, I've had that a couple of times where people have either passed away in Spain and then they wanted to repack the loved one back because they were on holiday, but actually the cost wasn't feasible, so they had them cremated in Spain. And because in Spain things happen a lot quicker, like you said about Vietnam. And then they did bring them back, and obviously they've either just carried them in the hand luggage with the receipt. That sounds awful. Sorry, with the certificate. But I just wondered, in this case, you're not with the family, are you? So it's so it's almost like a cargo box. Then
it's treated exactly the same as a human remains shipment of a coffin. There's a consignee who will receive the coffin at the airport. So it rather than going in the normal, with a passenger, it goes off cargo as any other coffin would.
So it's separated from normal packages. It's not. Okay, that was me thinking it might just actually be put in with, I don't know.
No, they do
clothes. I don't know. Sorry, it sounds really random.
They're not with the suitcases. They're in a separate section of the cargo hold. And obviously human remains are treated slightly differently to other cargo by the airlines.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Good questions, Robert.
Thanks, John. Hi, Ed. Thanks for that. Just a quick question. When you said the 32 coffins when they arrived in Vietnam, you said there was ambulances lined up to take them away. Do you know what happened to them then? Did they go to funeral homes in Vietnam, or what was the kind of process on that side?
So we consigned every coffin to the government. So on the airway bill, which is like the ticket for the freight, it was the consignee was actually the Vietnamese government. So they were the ones who actually were able to collect the coffin from the cargo handler of Vietnam Airlines. They had then planned ambulances to be lined up at the airport. So each individual coffin could be placed onto a particular ambulance and taken to a certain place. Now, for funerals that took place in like Ho Chi Minh or Saigon or Hanoi in the cities, they potentially would have gone to funeral homes.
Mm-hmm.
But in the villages a lot of the villages we visited, they don't have funeral homes. It's just not that kind of place. Obviously, in the cities they do, but what I saw in the city, if you were in Ho Chi Minh City, you could be in any city in the world, but you go out to the villages and the difference was just to see with your own eyes.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
So is there I don't know much about Vietnamese. So did the ones that went out to the villages, would they have just went out and basically straight to a burial plot or straight to a
so
families, like
there's a lot of Catholics and a lot of Buddhists in Vietnam. So the Catholics, they actually have churches in the villages. So they would have. There are some clips online of the coffins actually in Vietnam, and you'll see a couple of them in churches.
Yeah.
So they had them out in churches before they were taken to the cemeteries. Yeah.
Yeah, it was because you were saying obviously they kind of wanted things done as quick as possible, you know, and obviously by the time they were repatriated and arrived back in Vietnam, you know, I was wondering, did they, for want of a better phrase, did they take them directly to the crematoriums, you know, to kind of speed things up, or what kind of process they went?
Well, from what I gather, they had them in the homes for a day, because from the footage I've seen, all of the families gathered in the homes around the coffin. With the Catholics, they were obviously buried.
Yeah.
A lot of the Buddhists were cremated. I'm not sure on the process of the cremation, how it works there.
Well, sorry, do you know off the top of your head, or do you know the exact? So from when the deceased were discovered in the lorry until repatriation to or arriving in Vietnam, what was that timeline? What was the?
Well, the date of death was the 23rd of October, and I'd have to check on the exact dates, but it's about 6 weeks, I think.
Right.
But the other thing I didn't really touch on, which I probably should have in the talk, was the embalming process. We didn't actually have to do the embalming process ourselves. Another funeral director took it off their own back to do the embalming of the deceased. At
what point?
Did they contact the embassy?
No, it was nothing to do with the embassy. So still, I'm not completely sure on what exactly happened, but after they'd done the post-mortem examinations and the deceased needed no further evidence taken from the body themselves, the deceased were transported by private ambulance from the coroner's mortuary to a funeral home. They were all embalmed and then all taken back to the coroner's mortuary. And from what I've been told, that was done on the expectation that firm would be dealing with the repatriation. That had nothing to do with the Vietnamese embassy, and it had nothing to do with us. The only connection we can make at this stage is something to do with the police, but that's all we know.
You think
that's interesting.
A relationship,
a
relationship with the coroner and that funeral home?
Yeah, they must have an appointed funeral director.
Yeah.
What position were they in for viewing? Would they have been able to view the families?
Well, we would have advised them of not to, probably. I mean, I know most of them did. I think the embalming, even if it had been done the day after they died, wouldn't have been particularly effective because of the heat because a lot of people thought they actually froze to death, but actually what happened was with it being a sealed refrigeration lorry, obviously it's airtight. If the refrigeration had been on, even though it would have been cold, they would probably have survived. But because it was off, it was an airtight container, so there was only so much oxygen in there, and it got extremely hot very quickly. So by the time the deceased were discovered, they'd already deteriorated a lot.
Sorry, Ed, I can't remember I can remember the story, but not much of the details. Do you know how long were they in there for? Do you know?
It was a matter. I think it was about 8 hours from when they actually passed away to when they were found. because they travelled through Belgium on a lorry and into Essex, and then the driver of the truck actually got to where he was going to unload the lorry to like get everyone out, and when he opened it, he discovered they'd all passed away. Sorry, what did you say?
I read the article, yeah, but did he know that he was in there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's been prosecuted for that, has he not? The Irish guy.
Yeah. There was actually a TV show about the whole investigation and the prosecutions about 2 months ago. It was on I think it was BBC One.
Yes, one I thought I didn't realise the Vietnamese. Yeah, I have one.
It's quite a big gang, wasn't it? A gang set up.
Youngish chap. Yes, I remember now.
Sorry,
I think the most interesting point for me when this was discovered was, how many times has it happened previous to that where maybe people haven't passed away, or, if it maybe wasn't in such higher numbers, because as you said, they got to his destination and authorities were contacted because of what had happened. But, has that happened before where maybe 1 or 2 people have died and they've just disappeared, because they're untraceable, nobody knows they're here, nobody knows they'll disappear. That's a scary thought.
It is going on, but that was the thing that was highlighted, that these guys, it's like a proper operation that these lorry drivers are involved in, really. So it's quite concerning.
Can I just ask a question?
What's going?
Ed, you mentioned death. How did the coroner determine what the date of death was, because of obviously the travel time and when they were eventually found?
It was actually in that in the program on the telly. They described how they worked out from the time it was closed at the port, when they shut the lorry, to the time they got to the UK. They could work out, from text messages that people in the lorry had sent, and voice messages and stuff that was on the phones, but also how much oxygen would have been in that. They were able to determine the death actually occurred in British seas. But if that, I don't know whether you can watch that program anymore, but it was the way they did it and determined it was quite quite complex, really.
Okay. Yeah, push on.
Hi, Ray.
All right, Joe.
Sure. Obviously, all the repack set up arrangement with yourself. The consignee is a funeral director, or like you say, the government.
Yeah.
In that case, have you ever, or can it be, just for instance, a family member, or does it have to be like an official company?
It depends on the country. So in the UK, because we allow anyone to do funerals in theory, there's no, apart from the CMA regulation, you can do a home funeral. In theory, you could consign a coffin to someone in the UK, anyone, and they could just turn up with a suitable vehicle, collect the body, and it's the same in most countries. Some countries are very strict on, like in the US, for example, where it's regulated very strictly. You can only consign to a funeral home, but it depends on the country. You would expect it to be like that here in the UK, but obviously we all know it isn't. But then in some countries that you wouldn't expect it to be strict, it is. So it just depends on the destination, really. Obviously, when we're arranging a repatriation, we always ask the family who will be receiving the coffin in the homeland, especially like Islamic countries. That's usually family, because they don't necessarily have funeral homes there. So family would hire an ambulance, go to the airport, collect the body, and then straight to the cemetery for burial.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because of the coffin specifications. You then got family having to sort out removing of the zinc liner, haven't you? So,
have you ever heard of CAD seal, John?
I have heard of CAD seal. I've never seen it, but I've heard of it.
It's like a foil on a roll that it's basically like a foil body bag that you heat seal, and that creates a hermetic seal. So if we know a family are going to be burying somebody in that coffin and they don't want it to be zinc lined, then we use CAD seal as an alternative.
Brilliant.
Yeah, we've had one.
CAD seal. No, thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
Any other questions at all for Ed? No.
Off subject, you know when people come out on the boats and stuff, I don't know if everybody can hear me.
He's speaking this
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So whose onus would it be? Would it be our onus or in the sea? You know.
So what about people travelling over from France?
Yeah.
I suppose if it's close to the UK.
There's deaths. We do that in the book actually, yeah. But if you've got the answer, Ed, if you want to cover that.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but I think obviously the way we are as a country, if there was a number of deceased people here and no embassy or group stepped up to actually fund their funerals, I'm sure our government would deal with that. And it's the same as if someone dies in a hospital in the UK, the hospital are actually liable to pay for the disposal of their body if there's no family to do so.
It comes down to the orders where death takes place, who retains responsibility. Yeah. We've also covered today as well about if death takes place in the air on an aircraft. Obviously, it depends whether the plane lands, and also on ships as well. So in the Royal Navy, we were always told when you get pirates trying to get on board, the second they get on board a ship, they can claim asylum. Yeah. Because it's classed as British territory. Yeah. So
yeah.
Like Robert.
Yeah, sorry, just what you're saying. We actually dealt with in 2018. One of Donald Trump's security guards passed away while he was in Scotland, and we dealt with the kind of embalming and repatriation of, well, not repatriation. He went back on Air Force One, but we dealt with the deceased while he was here. So we took the deceased CIA or Secret Service guy to our parlour in Glasgow. But like you were saying there, Ed, it was very, very strange. So when that guy was in our parlour in Glasgow, that was technically classed as American territory while he was there. The Secret Service stayed in the parlour with the body overnight. So our guys had to stay with them. So they stayed and guarded the body overnight while it was in our parlour. And then at 6 o'clock the next morning, a van arrived and took the deceased to the airport. They were all really great to deal with, but that was slightly different on the part where we got absolutely no involvement with that repatriation in terms of paperwork or anything. We were literally just a facilitator for the service, because we own a chauffeur drive company as well. So during COP26 there in Glasgow, we did the chauffeur stuff for something like 7 or 8 of the 11 nations that were visiting. So we had something like 200 cars a day supplying the UN and all these places. So we worked quite closely with the US Embassy. But that was a strange one. I just thought I'd mention that because we just facilitated the body. We did nothing else in terms of the repatriation.
We had a similar case. It was a well-known journalist from the US. And the government took over, actually, because he'd previously been in the American Air Force. We had a contact at the Air Force, and basically they said, we want his body collected in a casket and delivered to this airport at this time. And that was it.
We've done that a few. In Glasgow, we used to do the police contract, so the coroner's contract reviews. We did it for the Procurator Fiscal. Yeah. And we are quite close to Faslane nuclear base, so we've did a few things there. But we've done a few. I did one just at the very start of the pandemic, and it was on the news as well for a kind of middle-aged guy who died in a hotel in Glasgow with his family through COVID. But this guy was only visiting. They were all Scottish, but they were visiting from Dubai. Yeah. But he had some sort of military or something involvement in Dubai. And on a few different occasions for different places, we've taken what we would call shells into the police mortuary, and the next minute they're getting a call from some higher up somewhere saying, you know, somebody will be here at X time to collect that body. Don't touch it. Don't do anything with it. There'll be somebody down to watch it. And the same with Faz Lane. They wouldn't let us on the base at all. They would bring the deceased to us, and so it's all very kind of cloak and dagger. But it's strange for us when we're so process driven, to kind of be told to stand back and not do certain things.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, Ed, thank you again. It's been really, really interesting. That's really helped us now with the unit. So thank you so much, and enjoy your day.
Cheers.
Cheers, Ed. Yeah, cheers, Dave.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. We'll do that, guys. Just 5 minutes now. Cup of tea. Back in here for 5 to 11, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And then we'll start Unit 7 properly. That's going to help a lot now with Unit 7. So we'll crack on with that.
I do remember him telling me how the Vietnamese repatriations, just as we was on the general conversation. I never thought to ask him too much detail.
Yeah,
I don't know if he would have not.
Well, I've recorded it. I need to speak to him about it. Is he comfortable with sharing that? So obviously. Huge task. That's a huge task.
Yeah, I remember because my friend's dad back from Greece.
Yeah.
They were.